Hi, everyone. Norm, thanks so much for that awesome story. That was really exciting. I'm so glad you had a good experience using HotelTonight. So I'm Jongejan. I manage recruiting at HotelTonight, and we have a panel here of excellent people within the startup community. So just going to take a moment to introduce themselves. Go ahead, Tammy.
I can start. I'm Tammy. I work at. Can you hear me?
Is it on the bottom? Yeah.
Hi. Okay. I'll keep it down here. I'm Tammy. I work at First Round. I support our 270 early stage companies, including Sift Science and HotelTonight, with their recruiting efforts.
That was very succinct. My name is Liz, as they said. I work with Sift Science, which is a machine learning cloud-based platform that works with companies worldwide that helps prevent fraud and also eliminate top-line revenue loss.
My name's Jeff, and I work at HotelTonight, and we provide same-day or week-out hotel bookings to help people create great experiences. I've been at HotelTonight 6 months, so I'm kind of new to the startup world. Prior to that, I was at Google, and prior to that, IBM. So my experience is just getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So I'm happy to share some of the learnings of going between startup and big companies.
Okay, thanks. So in thinking about today and what we wanted to talk about and present to all of you, we were thinking about company culture and some of the things that people often think of when they think of culture. And some of the things that we thought of were the office environment, the events, the clothes. Is it a hoodie and t-shirt or suits? The perks. The free lunches, and we realize that that's all very much part of a company's culture, but more important to a company's culture, we believe, are the company's values. And so we wanted to talk today about our experiences working at startups and how we've seen other startups in Silicon Valley incorporate their company values into their recruiting and hiring strategy. So first, a show of hands, so we know our audience. How many of you work at companies smaller than 300 people? Okay, about a third. Okay, great. So start off. How do you guys think of company values? And is there a definition for a company value?
Maybe I'll start. So the way I think values are things that are enduring, they'll endure the test of times, and they're a set of beliefs that help you make decisions, and you're probably going to carry them with you throughout your life, and I think the same is true of a company. And they're the things that help you make the really difficult choices that you'll need to make. They help you attract people that share your values and because people want a sense of belonging. And this is on? You know, so and I believe they are things that, regardless of what your competition does, regardless of what changes internally, they will always be true. And I think they're different than your culture, although they might be linked. Your culture is just the set of actions that are happening within your company, and that's just the sum total of what everyone does. That's your culture, and it's important to know your values so that you can in some way help to shape and guide your culture to be what you want it to be. And so that's why it's, I think, important to know what those values are. Anyone else? Thoughts?
I agree 100%. The only thing I would add is that just from our lessons learned as an earlier stage startup is that it's also like how you show up every day and hold yourselves accountable to your coworkers, right? So it's like, it helps with your decision making, absolutely, but it also helps you make sure you're all operating from the same context and the same frame of reference, which I think is really important.
Okay, so we obviously see that there's great value in creating values. Tammy, you work with 270 startups in the Bay Area, so you probably have seen a lot of companies create their values. Is there a right time to create values when you're just an early stage two founders, or possibly waiting until later? What have you seen?
Can you hear me? Okay. So I tend to be introduced to companies when they're in the most formative period, which is 0 to 2 people. And usually we've found companies think about culture and company values a little too late. Once companies go from 0 to 30 and are in the 30 to 50 stage, it's when a company stops being a family and it actually becomes a company. And I think once the founders decide to have some values to hold themselves to, they need to exist for a little bit and evolve as the team starts to form.
And do you feel that companies, and maybe if you have a specific example of a company, are any more successful waiting until that family has moved into a company, or doing it at the 0 to 2 stage?
Being that there's not a lot to be shared between just 2 people, it's hard to establish something that's going to persist, as Jeff mentioned, for like the length of a company, if it's 5 years, if it's 10 years, especially established on day one. But it's nice to have a sort of framework that you're holding, like all the hires that you're making and all the candidates that you're interviewing to. And I think that the more input you gather from the people that you bring on, it certainly evolves those core values.
Okay, thank you. So how do you decide what the values are and ensure that they're shared amongst the company?
Being that it's a discussion that should be shared across the company, there should be collaboration and input from everyone across the organization. It should be bottom up, and everyone should be living by these company values. It shouldn't be a decision that a leadership team makes during like a one-day offsite. So having them physically present, maybe, or physically visible for everyone to hold themselves to, I think, is a constant reminder to make sure that everyone's holding themselves to these core values.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I think I slightly disagree on values, and my perspective is values are probably best created among a small group of people. I think it's hard to get an entire organization to input on values and come up with something that's going to be clear, stand the test of time, concise, and allow you to make the most difficult decisions that you'll have to make. I think by consensus you get things that are often sort of watered down. So I think the way that they're created, now Jenny and I happen to be really fortunate that we work at a company where the values were created by our founders really as soon as they had the idea. And that's because they were entrepreneurs in other places, and they said that we don't just want to build a company that we're going to go and sell to someone else. We want to build something that stands the test of time, where people can come and do their best work. And therefore they created the values in the first week, which is kind of unique, and it's pretty awesome to work at a place like that because it is naturally everywhere and everyone sort of lives and breathes them. So I think if I were advising, I'd say create it early, create it among the founding group or the employees that are your top performers, and if you don't have them, I think you probably can share how you went about creating them. I think if you don't have creating values, and my experience here comes more from the Google example within teams, is get the employees that you think really live and breathe where you want to be in the future, that are doing the best work, and get their input and hone it down to something small. I think by consensus, you often get something that's kind of like pleases everyone, but really guides no one.
So Liz, how do you decide how many values are enough values? Like Google has 10 things that are googliness. Netflix has 9 values. How many is appropriate?
We try to ascribe to the keep it simple, silly solution where 5 or less I think is really great. It's hard for people to keep, especially nowadays with all the distractions in our lives. It's hard to keep many more things than 5 things top of mind at any given moment. So when we revisited our values, we definitely tried to keep it to 5 or less.
Okay, so I have a question for the audience. How many of you, by a show of hands, how many of you, by a show of hands, have worked for a company who has a set of company values? Okay, vast majority. Okay. how many of you could recite word for word those company values? Okay, thanks. Yeah, so about so most everyone has a set of company values, and about 50% of those people could recite their values. So Tammy, you work with a lot of startups, helping them come up with values. Is there a simple framework, aside from maybe the 5 or less, that a company may follow to come up with something simple and memorable that everyone can recite?
Sure. One of the most simple frameworks that I've seen that's actually worked a lot with a lot of our early stage companies is the 3 Ps. And I heard it initially from Jeff Lawson at Twilio. He's the CEO. People, product, and process. And if you can ensure that the values ascribe to those 3 characteristics, it's generally a pretty clear framework, because I think with yours, it's build, question, respect. And you can elaborate on that.
Oh yeah, that is the framework. I don't know that they did it consciously, but yeah, ours are build, which is about the fact that we move quick and we want to get things in prototype, test it, see how it works. Question, which is about just constantly questioning the status quo. We don't want to do things the same way, but we want to really look at the root of the problem. And then respect is how we believe in treating everyone in our ecosystem. So our customers, our hotel partners, and employees. But it is exactly those 3 Ps. So. And seems to work, so it's an example of one.
One great example.
Yeah.
And Liz, how does Sift Science embed your company values into their everyday life? How do people show up at work at Sift Science?
Yeah, so that's actually a little bit of a nuanced question. So part of our journey was we did establish our values really early on, and they were simple, they were kind of to the point. But ultimately, we didn't do a great job of making sure those were top of mind for everyone. And we actually, when we were kind of doing some diagnosis of what we wanted to change or improve in our culture, we actually realized that some of the things could be tied directly back to our values, and maybe taken to the extreme could produce some of the behaviors we didn't want to see. So we went through a whole process of reevaluating these and keeping them top of mind. And a little bit different than Jeff's experience, since we did have values that were already in place, people already came to our company with those values in mind, it resonated with them at some level. We had to kind of go through this whole change management process of soliciting input. The leadership team still did kind of throw something at the wall first to get some input and guidance around, and then we kind of iterated them over time. And so now that we've officially launched them actually again about a week or 2 ago, so this topic is very timely for us, we already have it built into our interview scorecard. So when we're talking to candidates, are they exhibiting these values? The first time a recruiter will get on the screen with a candidate, they're talking about some of the values and how that plays out in life. I think one of the greatest things about working at a startup is that you oftentimes, they have the missionary mercenary thing that you hear about all the time in startup life. And almost every candidate we get on the phone with, they want to know about the culture, they want to know what we value, they want to know these things, and having kind of a rule book and a playbook to guide them from the first conversation really helps kind of extend that conversation through the hiring process, but even on their first day.
So quick follow-up question on there. Was there a particular event or timing on how the leadership team or the founders decided that it was time to have this revisit to the values and really go through this entire change management process?
It was somewhat serendipitous in nature, insofar as that I'm also nerding out on a grad school program in organizational design. And I did a case study on my company. Shh, don't tell my company. At one of my grad school on-sites. And then we were doing all this diagnosis into some of the things, because our founding team had noticed that there were behaviors in the office, and actually, to be honest, they were really good behaviors by many definitions. Everyone's really nice, they're humble, they're respectful. But what we found is that people were not challenging one another. They weren't really bringing the best ideas to the table, and there was a little bit too much politeness, almost the British polite, where they won't challenge you. And so we really wanted to change that, but we also wanted to keep the things about our culture that we really cared about. And so when I was sitting there with some of my colleagues and my classmates, we looked back at the company values, and respect and humility were 2 of the values that we used to hold very dear. And I could see in any one of those situations, taken to the extreme, somebody could define humility as well, I don't want to give you my opinion because I'm sure you're thinking about everything the right way. I don't want to get in your way. I don't want to challenge you. And so we realized that while those 2 things were pillars of our culture, they were actually overused strengths in this case. So once I had the conversation with the leadership team about that discovery, then they were like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's probably time for us to revisit these anyway. And it got the ball rolling from there.
That's an excellent example. Thanks for sharing that. So now we have the company values established. You started to touch on this a little bit, Liz, of implementing them into the recruiting and hiring process, talking to candidates from the initial phone screen. They want to know about the culture, the values, make sure that they share in the same mission as the company. Jeff, you mentioned our values, build, question, respect. How have you been able to implement, or how are you implementing those values into the hiring strategy at HotelTonight?
Well, we're doing it together. So how we're doing this is, so I think particularly in hiring, I think about it in kind of two spaces. One is the process itself. So I always believe you should live the values. So candidates that come in, do they experience, build, question, respect? And so that's one. And then the other is what the criteria are, but maybe coming to process. So we have what we call a test drive, or really kind of a working session that we do with candidates with many candidates if they get far along in our process. Others have tests that they do at different points. And that's really our build value. And we want to see, how do people quickly take an idea, put it into concept, get people's feedback. On the respect, we try to make sure our entire process gives people feedback at the end. It gives you a bit more feedback than you might get elsewhere. At least that's what we aspire to do. So we make sure that our process at every stage is our values, so that people are going to see, like, oh, that's a company I want to be a part of, because I see how they treat other people. And then is on the, I guess, selection side, is we have built a hiring scorecard so that we can be explicit about what are positive behavioral indicators and negative behavioral indicators on each of the values. So for example, and it was interesting to create this because we shared it with the founders, and Jenny and I took a stab based on looking at what were all the criteria we had in all the roles we currently had open. We mapped those back to our values, and then we shared it with the co-founders, and they had disagreements about what might be a build value, a question value, or was something really even a value. But those things are really specific behaviors. So there are things like, do they question the problems that are put forward to them in an interview, come up with alternate solutions, and take a point of view on the right path forward? That was a positive indicator. A negative indicator is they take the problem as given and they present limited solutions. So some positive and negative. So that's kind of how we have built it in.
Okay, and Liz, I know we talked beforehand that as Sift Science has moved to creating this new set of values, that you have also started incorporating it into the interview process, and I think your scorecard as well. Can you talk a little bit about your experience?
Yeah, so one we were just talking about earlier, the respect and humility, trying to morph it into the new land, is now it's be tough on ideas but excellent to each other. That's the value, and so we have that now on our scorecard. And we're looking for, this is classic HR stuff. I'm sure a lot of you people are knowing this, like behavioral-based interview questions, right? Like, tell me about an example of a time where you had conflict on your team, or how you worked through it, or tell me about a time where you were working on a project and you were like at 180 degrees at odds with your coworker. How did you work through it? And then you're looking for kind of the themes of respect and humility, but you also want someone that's not just going to back down and acquiesce, right? You want to see someone who's going to stand up for what they believe in. So we're trying to tie. And it's a little bit prescriptive from, HR people ops right now, because not everyone has these skills naturally to figure out the best questions to ask. So I think if you're thinking about integrating your values into your interview process more, I think Jeff's examples of kind of questions and things that you're looking for, that's going to have to be a little bit of guidance. Like, people aren't going to always get that naturally. You're going to have to help them along the way. Maybe give them a few questions that you think will resonate really well with some of those values that they can choose from, like an arsenal that they can get comfortable with. And over time, when people start getting used to interviewing for those values, they'll adapt them and they'll change their interview questions a little bit to be present in the moment. But I think it's good to help people as much as possible with that journey, because it's not going to be something that comes intuitively to most of your interviewers.
Okay, interesting. So Tammy, you work with 270 companies. Like, how much support are you giving companies in sort of helping them through the process of incorporating their values into their hiring strategy?
Sure. Especially, so I work the closest with our earliest stage companies that are in the 0 to 18-month phase, only because you wonderful people are taking on that part of the organization for me once companies get to a growth stage point. I generally revisit broader questions that are specific to like what are your current active needs, like how do you describe your culture, like what are your company values, so that when I do speak to potential candidates for our portfolio companies, I can then evangelize our companies properly. And sometimes through that process, I discover that some of our companies don't have like clearly defined company values, and that's when we sit down for an exercise and walk through like good examples of companies that have good like templates. But that being said, your company values have to be specific to your company because you have to live through that, and your employees do as well. You can't just borrow someone else's because it would be hard for people to carry that out through their interview processes organically. And I will say on an annual basis, those values should be revisited just to make sure they're still true to your company and like unique to HotelTonight. You guys have been around for a few years, and even though they were discovered and designated the first week, it's surprising to see how it still holds true. And I will say that, interestingly, even with Facebook as big as they are today, one of the biggest discoveries that one of their VPs of HR had mentioned was 80% of your company and your cultural values is the founder's personality.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue to, you might be saying this, but like since values are so personal, how do you really interview for them?
Well, it is hard. In some sense, it's like a virtuous cycle, because if you get people who are aligned to your values, then they're going to be able to know what that looks like. But I do think it's important that you put down clear criteria of what good and not so good looks like. And then to your point, and I think it sounds like you're further along than maybe we started to build out, what are questions that actually allow you to test against those values, and then you train managers against that. But I think that's the the best guidance. I think some of the other things we've done is we build into the entire recruiting process. So when we open a role, we ask managers what they're going to be required, what's going to be required along each of the values. So we actually say, what are the builder values that you're going to want to see in this role? What are the question values? What are the respect values? And how are they going to show up in specific behaviors? So it's just coaching managers to think about that. Then when they go in interviews, we assign interviewers a specific area, and then we collect feedback in that way. And then when we have sort of the wrap-up panels, we talk about how the candidate performed against the values. And then hopefully, once we capture more data, we'll actually understand, are these values serving us, I think, to your point, and where might we have to tweak or change some of the things that we think our values mean that maybe they shouldn't mean. Is that?
Yeah, that answers the question. And then previously, Jeff, you said we go as far as treating candidates with respect by giving them more feedback than they might get somewhere else. And I'd be really interested to know at Sift Science, is there anything within the candidate experience or even employer branding that you do to communicate the values to candidates?
They're 2 weeks old. So not yet, but it is something we're thinking about. We actually are going through a whole kind of employer branding thought process right now. As you may notice, I'm going on leave soon, so some of our plans have gotten a little bit delayed. But right now we have a lot of very positive Glassdoor reviews, which we're very fortunate to have for existing employees. But we do want to take it a little bit further, and we've got some Q&A things that we provide candidates. So we surveyed our entire company and asked people questions to respond to, like a Q&A type thing and like a FAQ for new candidates, like about the culture at Sift and the values there, but not necessarily with the values 2.0 yet.
Yeah. So is that for candidates or is that for new employees?
We want to instill the values from the candidate experience and have them coming into that on day one. And then from there we have kind of a little Sift EDU series. So they meet with the CEO, they meet with different product leaders and different functional areas for an hour. There's 5 or 6 different sessions. One of those is about kind of our values and how we work as a company. But there are also loads of other things that we're trying to do in terms of like office things, like visual reminders and like tangible reminders of like what our values are. But we haven't, obviously, 2 weeks, so we're still working on it.
Okay. So I know diversity is top of mind to a lot of companies. So would values clash with diversity? How do you manage that? Jeff, do you have? Jeff and I have previously talked about like the beer test. Would I want to have a beer with this person? Or the airplane test, would I want to sit next to this person on an airplane across country? You know, that results in you hiring people who are very similar to you and not necessarily a diverse pool. So how do you, like, are there other ways to test for integrity than the beer test?
I get one. You just hope it doesn't happen, but that's not gonna be a good answer. So I think the real answer to how you make sure that you're open to a diverse pool of talent is whatever way you do it, whether it's based on values or attributes or behaviors, you just be really objective about what are the real requirements for the role. We've chosen to do it along our values. I think, at Google, they did it along certain, other attributes. But if you can just be really objective and say, what's a criteria for this role? So let me give you, I'll give you maybe an example of how this has played out. We had a role open for someone on our finance team. It was an analytical role. Someone needed to take data and present it to the company with insights to drive actions. And all the feedback wrapped up along our around our values framework. And there was a lot of feedback. The person was quiet. People were like, I'm not sure they're going to be able to influence others because they're just not loud enough. Like sometimes you just don't hear them. And we were able to go back to our values and say there is no value around being loud. That is not a value here. So let's go back to what the values are. And they're around, is this person a problem solver who can take their ideas, convey them clearly, and influence others? And have they done that in the past? The answer was yes. We hired the person, and they're doing a great job. And so I think that's kind of how, if you can be objective, you can find the right person, and just make sure the criteria are real. So I mean, while some fit of a beer test or taking the person to lunch is good to see if they're not going to be sort of just out of place in your environment, but you want to be careful about that, I would think.
Either of you have anything to add or?
I was going to say, for diversity, I think so many companies think about diversity recruiting so late when they realize, they look around the room and it's 20 Dartmouth grads and it's a very homogeneous culture. And yes, they might be high performers because they come from well-pedigreed backgrounds. But I think there's something to be said about companies like HotelTonight, where they walk through a job rec and they think of the ideal profile for what this person would look like. Would they come, if it was a product manager, would this person come from being a software engineer and then transitioning into a product role? Would they just be a person who had project management skills, or someone who had complementary skills and maybe a role with a different title? And I think diversity is a big question because it involves diversity of background in terms of prior employment experience and schools, also the race and gender. But I think it's very important. One thing I will say, though, one of the companies that I'm familiar with has a 95% retention rate for employees, and it's because they based their recruiting mostly on referral-based recruiting, because good people tend to know other great people. And I wanted to touch on something that was discussed earlier about when you really incorporate the introduction of values to potential candidates. I think every touch point you have with a candidate, from your first email to your first meeting to every meeting subsequent, your values should be embedded, and if you can, make it as organic to the process as possible. One of our companies, Percolate, they're a Series C company in New York. They also have an office in San Francisco. They went from 15 to 60 pretty quickly in 1 year. And for them, they realized in order for these values to be correctly communicated to each candidate, each new hire, they had to be intentional about this timeline that they held their company and all of their members to, especially as they were growing to different offices. And especially because as soon as someone starts at a company, like they need a Sherpa that will walk them through and introduce them to the existing company values, so that way these people can live it in the future when they become hiring managers.
Okay, thanks. And to your example, Liz, earlier of Sift Science making the change to decide that it was time to look at the current values, like for anyone in the audience who might be at that stage where the people on the current team, their values are clashing, or they don't seem to all be aligned, or not everyone's united around one set of core values, like how do you know it's time? Like at what point do you realize that it's time to either let some of your values go, or maybe all of them, or add a couple of new values?
So the answer is always to tie it back to your business case. Like if there's a deal you lost, or a product that failed, or something that went wrong, and you can diagnose it back to like how the team worked together, or how they did or did not show up in the right way for those interactions, and you can have some kind of like logical and objective reflection on what happened. I think those are always the most compelling reasons. You want to be, I think personally, this is an opinion only, you want to be really wary if it's just one person on the leadership team who's like really gung-ho about changing all the values and no one else is really feeling the urgency, because it does have to be something that everyone's kind of bought into. It's got to be like a joint diagnosis with multiple people. It can't just be the people person who's like, we got to change our value, because it's not, doesn't really go over so well. So I think it definitely has to be, you always got to tie it back to your business case in any way that you can. And that's usually the best way, because at the end of the day, you may be a family, but ultimately you're there to build a great company and build a great business. So it always has to tie back to that.
Okay, thanks. So we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. Quickly before we get there, like one key takeaway to give to the audience that maybe they can implement tomorrow. Walk away from here remembering. Jeff, what's one thing you would say?
Start with you. What's one thing? A practical tip, something you could do tomorrow. Yeah.
Yeah, practical, something tactical.
I think the practical thing. I mean, if you don't have to build your values in, I would say the scorecard for us has been the most sort of beneficial thing, because it's build a scorecard and make it measurable, because that will then allow you to understand if it's having a business impact, if you need to make adjustments, and will let you make the business case when and if it comes time to change things, and to know if your own process is effective. So I think that would be my one thing.
Thank you. Liz, what's your one takeaway?
It's actually my general rule for all things in life, but never make assumptions, specifically about people and whether or not they grok your values. So I think if you're thinking about integrating your values into your interviewing workflow in any way, shape, or form, be explicit about how that needs to translate to your team and what kind of questions make sense and what are the indicators you're looking for. And I think Jeff had a great example of like, you want to give them positive examples and also not so positive examples so it can start to be tangible. So just don't assume that everyone's on the same, like we saw it here, 50% of you knew what your company values were. So make sure that everyone knows what they are first and how to measure them before you start integrating them into your workflow.
I think that it's important that people look at values as an ongoing process. It's constantly changing. Netflix has an awesome living doc, which they've posted online publicly. And when you write things down, it's great because words scale and people don't. And as they're written down, you can revisit them on an annual basis and see if your decisions are still holding true to the values that you've established.
Okay, thank you.